Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is episode number 17. We're recording it on Monday, November 9th at 3:26 p.m. Eastern time. And Josh and I spent the last episode, focused on the politics of today, but relating it to God, kind of like talking about what needs to do. But we both understood that it's really hard to maintain a focus on God. And I believe I believe that we have failed over the last several decades to solve a lot of problems because we have failed to understand God, to relate to God, to pray to God, to really know God's will. So Josh, start us off with why. Let's explore some of the reasons. Let's begin by exploring some of the reasons why maintaining our focus on God in addressing all these things is so difficult.
Well, how do we know God? God hasn't, come down and revealed God's self.
No, wait a minute.
I have my little statue of Jesus over here. I wasn't here when Jesus came around, right?
Wait a minute.
Go ahead.
If you say, how do we know God? Then you're talking about everyone else. Yes, but you and I, we just spent 5 episodes describing how God must exist. So how do we know God exists? Because every time you have a thought and every time I have a thought, we know that these are God's thoughts.
I'm getting there. So, how do we know anybody, right? And so I could know George as a person, and I feel like I really know George because he's a real person, right? I don't know all of George's thoughts. I don't know all of his history, right?
But I'm God. We're all God.
So we and religion, has kind of led us astray in this thinking of God as a deity, an entity that's transcendent and only transcendent and not in the material world, right? More spiritual than us. So it's, it was snake oil. It was very profitable, or, it was an easy way to get people's attention and get them to believe. And I think it had a lot of value and effect, but it also is a little misleading. And because of that, we haven't had this expansive view of God to be not expansive, transcendent up in the clouds, but expansive of all around us and in all material and in all causality, right? And so, George and I have been doing this episode on God, and it's all about God. And we find ourselves talking about all issues and, having trouble to tie it in. And I don't think we're having trouble. I think what's really going on
I'm having trouble. Speak for yourself.
I think that's the mind. I think that's the inner critic, right? The social, the social conformity part of our mind, saying, hey, this is an episode about God. People are going to be expecting you to say the word God, and you're just talking about politics or the illusions or something, right? And what's happening is we're being a spiritual mediator, right, between this transcendent idea of God as everything and bringing people up to speed with that, updating their consciousness with that. But yet we're still trying to talk in the old ways of what God is and kind of baby step it along, not that we're all, so much smarter than the audience. We just have this unique life path that we both share that have some overlap, where we've come to understand these concepts, maybe at the expense, personally for me, at the expense of some other things I would have liked to have accomplished in life that maybe the audience has accomplished, right? So we just have these kind of unique minds, and we're learning to speak in a unique way that we've learned, as we've shared with other people, they've found value from it. So we've been kind of encouraged and inspired to share it with the audience.
All right, I'm going to give my take, at least.
Go ahead.
One way it's difficult for me, or why it's difficult for me. We've been programmed. We've been programmed to not pray to God. We've been programmed to not seek out God's assistance. God helps those who help themselves. The media isn't talking about God. The corporations aren't talking about God. The religions aren't even talking about God. They're talking about these people, in the Bible that lived, a couple of thousand years ago. They're really not talking about God. So nobody's talking about God. And if nobody's talking about God, we're not understanding that. It's not within our basic everyday mindset. We're talking about, how we're going to make money, how we're going to become successful, how we're going to change the world, how we're going to defeat the other party. We're talking about everything else but God. And so that basically distracts us. It certainly distracts me. So let me veer away from that. Now, let me make an attempt now, having explained why it's difficult, to get back on track and talk about God. So, and a lot of stuff is new to people. Basically, the standard understanding of God in relation to us is that we are miserable sinners. It's our fault that we're not relying on God. It's our fault that the corporations aren't teaching us, and that the media, just presents everything but God, and even the religions are really remiss with this. So like, we're taught this is our fault, and this blame paralyzes us. We can't look at the situation clearly enough because we're taking responsibility for it, mistaken responsibility. So what's the answer to that? We need not just the world, but you and I, like, we all need to much, much more strongly understand that everything that's happening is God's will. We're not understanding this because God is not allowing us to understand this. We haven't solved poverty and all this crime and climate change because God hasn't allowed us to do this. Now, yeah, this is a difficult kind of truth for people to understand, but it seems, if history is any indicator, we're not going to solve these problems until we recognize that it's in God's power, and we need to pray to God, and we need to basically just, have God on our minds so much more and understand God properly, so that we will look at these problems and solve them in the right way.
All right, George, here's something God gave me while you were talking. And I'm curious to get your feedback on this. What part of speech is God, or the word God? Is that a noun? Is that a pronoun? Is it an adjective? Is it helpful to use it as all and think of it as all? Because I'm thinking, you said, the politicians aren't talking about God, the science, the education, the banks, right? You could say the same thing about spirituality. Which goes hand in hand with many people's concepts of God, right? And none of these institutions or religion and science, and I think that's really what needs to happen. Is it's a humility, it's a reconciliation with what we don't know, and what, our desire to do good, to be good, but we don't know all of the extent of causality. We don't understand all of why we do the things we do. And, but we have enough insight now. We have biology, psychology, sociology, all the sciences and all the religions, right? Who have, and they're still all baffled, but they've made so much progress that it's undeniable now. These illusions are undeniable. And so that just made me think, what part of speech? I'm going to try to think of God and the phrase God, the term God, when I pray to God, and meditate for a while on kind of taking it from this being that looks like an old white man in the clouds, figure, to, being able to use the term God as an adjective when I'm describing something, right? Or when I'm trying to understand cause and effect, or, how to be more spiritual when it comes to my relationships or conversations, or how I spend my time. So
Excellent point. So yes, God is certainly a being, but as you were saying, God is also a process. God is also cause and effect. God is why and how things happen. That's very important to know. I'm going to absolve God, and I'm staying much closer to God than I was before, so this is working. Now I'm going to absolve God by, yes, God is in control of everything, right? But God created Satan, and God, basically enlisted Satan to tempt us, and to tempt us so well that we're not able to overcome these temptations. We fall prey to these deceits and these lurings of Satan, and then we commit these sins, whether it's climate change or not treating each other kindly, and then Satan prosecutes us to God, and God punishes us, as this pandemic is showing. So, basically what has to happen, and this is theoretical, because if God is the only eternal being in the universe, that means not only, I believe you and I and everyone else has souls. I believe once we die, we continue to exist within God in a different form, but I don't believe that, our being is completely destroyed. But notwithstanding, we transform, whereas God is eternal, in a way that in a certain sense isn't transformed. So I think what needs to happen is, because Satan is also not eternal. Satan is just like human beings. Satan is a being that was created by God. God needs to, again, we were talking about this before. At first I suggested God destroy Satan, just like completely vanquish him. But I think a much better, much more intelligent and more evolved solution is that God converts Satan. God disempowers Satan from, or basically God just relieves Satan of his job of tempting and indicting human beings. Basically, we don't want Satan punished. We just want Satan disempowered. And again, how often do you hear, any congregation in any church talking about this possibility? I'll admit that it may or may not be possible, but it certainly seems possible. We pray to God for pretty much everything. Why can't we, and why shouldn't we pray for God to completely convert Satan so that he is not causing us so much harm anymore?
Yeah, George, this has been on my mind a lot to the last few episodes. And, we talked about these illusions. And, if imagine if the churches just dedicated themselves, just took even a month or, a year to dedicate themselves to understanding these illusions. And I bet the most amazing things on the planet would happen from that. So imagine, take for example, right? We didn't used to believe that addiction was a real thing. We didn't used to believe that depression or PTSD or ADHD, we didn't believe these were real things. We didn't even, all they were was sin. That was our only understanding of causality, right? And now that we understand those, we've been able to come up with ways to basically end that sin, what we thought was sin. And it wasn't through more shame, more blame, more condemnation, right? It wasn't even through, necessarily more going to church or more, prayer or memorization of the scriptures. It was through having a relationship with the causality, with God as causality of these situations, and relationship with the human beings that were experiencing it and suffering it. And doctors and even priests and, clergy made progress with this as well, and educators, to have this relationship with consciousness of these depressed or, the soldiers coming back from war with PTSD that was just destroying their lives, all of these, even especially addiction. And that's how we've cured. That's how we've essentially ended this sin, ended this basically Satan's evil on this planet, right? And this is all just so grounded in awareness of the illusions. We deny it, science denies it. They don't talk about it as what they do because they know it's so true, right? But it affects it. It's such a challenge to the ego that their egoic mind overpowers their scientific mind or overpowers their priest religious mind and won't let them speak these true aspects of God, right, to their congregations or to the scientific community, right? But if imagine if the congregations did that, how many problems we would solve, right? And how integrated all of these technologies and all of these techniques, right? All of these rituals, they're essentially, treating depression, treating addiction, treating PTSD. These are essentially very similar to the rituals that churches and congregations go through just to, on a regular basis, that they all go through just to maintain their own sanity. It's just a little bit of a variation for that individual who has that propensity for addiction or that propensity for ADD or depression or PTSD, whatever it is. But if these individuals are supported ritualistically and community-wise, then the literature is completely in agreement with this communal support, this cultural support of these illnesses, of these struggles, of these.
Josh, I agree with you. You're saying a lot of good stuff, and we have been able to make great strides in PTSD, in, you know, all the addictions, so many illnesses, so many, like, you know, medical conditions that we all have. We've made amazing progress because we've understood causality, because we've understood that everything happens according to cause and effect, and not because we have a free will, you know. And I get that, right? And but the thing is, that has not been enough. In other words, like, yes, our causal mind, and yes, I think part of what you're saying is that, you know, that we haven't completely or fully enough understood that nothing is up to us. We haven't completely or fully enough integrated this causal model into our science and into our problem solving. But I'm suggesting that one of the reasons that we haven't done that, perhaps the reason, if we want to make it singular, is because Satan is not allowing us to do that, because Satan is tempting us with money and ego and fame and comfort and whatever, you know, else Satan tempts us with. So, I mean, let's address that. I mean, fine, yes, better understanding causality, it may be, you know, extremely useful, but doesn't it seem to you that Satan is preventing us from doing that? And what do we do to respond to that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, let's look at it from both views. Let's reiterate what you were saying, right? So every time we solve these problems and have this deeper understanding of awareness of causality and basically awareness of the illusions to be able to treat these conditions or solve struggle or reach our potential, right? We're doing battle, we're doing spiritual battle, and we're winning, we're succeeding, we're doing, you know, God's will essentially. And doing that, and also that is diminishing the existence of Satan and evil, right? And so imagine like a video game that we're playing, right, as a species, right? And so every time we do that, you know, like you're saying, Satan's hold on the world, Satan's you know, legitimacy or reality is diminished a little bit more, right? And as we do it, we're doing spiritual battle, but we're also basically transforming evil and Satan and what used to be sin into goodness, insight, logic, rationale, reason, you know, community, techniques, and spirituality, right? And so that's what I think I'm getting the most out of this conversation that we're having.
Well,
You know,
dude, I mean, I get it. So, like, we're succeeding to a certain extent, and it's working. But, you know, how do we stop Satan from having it work better, or from you know, not allowing us to understand it well enough?
Well, from my perspective, and you have to give me a minute to explain this, what's happening is, you know, these old religions, or let's say the old versions of the religions, all the religions are valuable and still good. The old versions were carrying so much baggage, and all they knew how to do essentially to kind of have to understand causality was to make these very blanketed dogmatic rules. And it usually, to be honest, was no different than the fights you'll see on the Nature Channel between monkeys and trees, chimpanzees killing each other over, you know, what chimpanzee gets to mate with another chimpanzee, or what chimpanzee gets the fruit, gets to eat the fruit, or, you know, and that kind of thing. And so what that does, you know, now that we understand true causality, it limits our ability to embrace it, right? So what happens is, you know, and this is well understood if you look at it from a comparative religion standpoint. What's happening is children and adolescents and young adults and even adults are feeling shame or blame for things they shouldn't, things that they didn't have control of, right? And that hurts, right? That hurts when we feel it, and that diminishes our sense of self, that diminishes our confidence. It's well studied. Our, you know, our happiness chemicals, our happiness neurochemicals deplete. Our anxiety chemicals like cortisol go through the roof when this happens, right? Because we're not lovingly supported with the true causality of reality. And so much of this comes around when, you know, our parents are an older generation and we're still adolescents, and there's a generation fight, right? And so the religion always sides on the you know, the parents' right to condemn, you know, the young adults' exploration into culture, music, sexuality, drugs that could be beneficial. It could be a spiritual plant, or something like that, right? And the church is just so in the dark ages, and the parents are taking this influence from the church and these old ways of thinking, and kind of not being able to sit down in a relaxed, comfortable setting with their children and say, you want to do this? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the best way to do it. And I want to support there. I don't want you to have to hide things.
Wait, Josh, this is so good, but how is that destroying Satan? Or not destroying Satan?
Because what happens is instead just the ego projection, the shadow projection, right? And so the parent, the elders in the church, I've lived through this hundreds of times and seen all my friends live through it and seen other people in ministry live through it.
But I think what you're saying is that, but I think what you're saying is like, in other words, like God helps those who help themselves. So basically we have to kind of like teach our children better and teach our children the right things and all. I get that, yes. But the problem is that Satan, working for God, of course, is not allowing us to do that.
Because we're denying these illusions. It all comes down to this hurt and injured ego.
Satan is preventing us from.
And this is how Satan does it, right?
Yes, so my question is, how do we stop Satan from doing that?
So we integrate this understanding of the illusions, right? And so religion, what's happening is we are having a collective psychotic break, a sociological psychotic break, because there's just like, if you look at the tree of the evolution of religion, there's thousands and thousands of branches. That's how we got all these religions. Every time one of them split off, what happened was there was a disagreement, right? It was usually a fight over one of these issues of we think we pray this way, and no, we think we pray this way, or we believe God knows who's saved. I chose to be saved, so God can't know that. It's me. I'm a good Christian. I'm a good whatever. So that caused a separation, and these are schisms, right? And now what's happening is there's schisms in our society, our sociological structure, right? So a psychotic break is essentially when the mind is split. It's torn between. It's a double bind where the mind is torn between two realities, two authorities in society, or two authorities in the household or the church that are fighting and can't sit down and appreciate each other, right? And when this happens, you're right. So now we're talking about how Satan is doing this, and what's happening is churches and religions are completely rejecting science, completely rejecting psychology and psychiatry, and even psychiatry is rejecting other parts of science, and psychology is rejecting other parts of science, and particularly the science that says free will is an illusion, that consciousness is not what it seems, and that this sense of self that we've been taught to think of ourselves and treat ourselves as if we have, and blame ourselves and blame each other, is not real. And each little schism is able to stay in their little filter bubble, right? And in that little filter bubble, we all try to, we as human beings have to kind of navigate. And every time we go into psychiatry, we have people in our church saying, oh, well, that's just because you're sinning. You need to stop sinning. You don't need a psychiatrist. You don't need a psychologist, right? And the same thing in politics. Politics is so far removed from science. Neither party is listening to science, and they don't want to, because that offends them. It insults their ego, and it makes them realize these illusion issues are something they're exploiting instead of using as a tool to benefit humanity.
All right, again, I agree with all that, but then the question still remains, we're not at that point where that has happened, and it's not because we don't want it to happen. And in other words, like, so like, yes,
you and I want it to happen, but the people in power don't want it to happen.
Right, but if you notice that you and I are having difficulty staying with God, that might be the world's problem. Maybe that we're relying too much on ourselves, on these interactional, societal, scientific, theological kinds of communal ways to address the problem, rather than relying on God. In other words, like, what happens is, like, when we ignore God, when we dismiss God, we don't put God as part of the equation of not just part of the equation, but of the fundamental equation of solving all this, then what happens? We separate ourselves from God by doing that. We're relying on ourselves. We're relying on on each other, on our science, on our knowledge, our knowledge of religion, and we're leaving God out of the picture. So I'm suggesting that may be the problem, that to the extent that we overly rely on our science and our politics and our media and society, we're missing it. We're missing where the real power is, that all we have to do is really like pray to God and ask God and stay connected with God. And all these things that we've been relying on ourselves to do for decades, but haven't been able to do, will finally become a lot easier.
Yeah, you started out that talk right there with that, you saying me and you are having trouble staying with God. And I want to clarify for the audience. I think what you mean is we're having trouble relating all this to God and keep mentioning God, right? And I think that is the schism, right? And that's what we're actually doing, is we're weaving it back and forth, right? And because, um, these are all spiritual concepts, even though it sounds like science, it sounds like psychology, it sounds like comparative religions. These are all spiritual concepts. This is all about God, right? And what we're actually doing as we do this, and as you and I struggle with this and have this conversation and get, some contentious points in it, we're actually doing that, right? We are essentially redefining God, right? The true definition of God is not going to change, but we don't even know what that is. And obviously no religion can agree on that. So that proves that, right? But we are redefining our definition, our understanding. We are updating it and bringing it up to speed, and we're integrating it across all of society, right? So it doesn't matter, if you're a psychologist, if you're a scientist, if you work at Starbucks, if you're the weatherman, you start to realize that you are in a spiritual position. You are essentially a priest, a shaman. And what you are doing is you are reaching out to people's consciousness and allowing them to experience reality as a spiritual thing, experience consciousness as a spiritual thing that connects us to God and to causality, right?
All right, we've got about 44 seconds left. This has been excellent. I think we've made a lot of progress. This is it's been our series really trying to tightly relate it to God. Josh, I know before these two recordings, you had some ideas you wanted to explore. We might want to actually just we'll see what God wants, because it's not up to us. We'll see. We may want to explore those during our next episodes of the show. So everyone, thanks for watching. And, we're going to be back again, talking about God, trying to stay with God, trying to solve problems, just reform Satan and improve our world in episode after episode. Thanks for watching.